we struggle so much to be present in the moment, and we are constantly lost in thinking about the future, or being melancholic, or being stuck in the past. And when you are in either of those, you're never here.
Tommaso, good morning.
Good morning.
So amazing to see you, and welcome to our podcast. I'm excited for our conversation.
Me too. Thank you for having me. Happy to have made it.
Yes, of course. And can you share, and this is where I would like to start, just a little more about your journey, what brought you to psychedelics, and specifically you're focusing on research with 5-MeO-DMT, the short-lasting psychedelic compound. So would love to hear more about your journey.
Yeah. It was like, where should I start? Should I start with 5-MeO, with depression, with love and relationships? There's like
a lot there, no?
A lot to talk about.
I would say maybe we can start with the personal journey. It's very interesting what brought you to psychedelics to begin with, and then we can see like how did you get into the research.
Yeah, like I have a bit of an unconventional path from like most of my colleagues, because my background is not really like biomedical sciences, and my main interest in psychedelics came from psychoanalysis. And I was very passionate and curious about like psychoanalysis and like the writings of Freud and Jung and all that part of like way of describing the psyche that I would say had a bit of more of a humanistic core rather than a biomedical one. And it was something that like drove me into like dreams and understanding dreams more. And at the same time, I was passionate in neuroscience, but I would say it was not my primary focus. And I started to like really reading about dreams and seeing how like the ideas of dreams, after having this bump of interest in the 1930s and 40s, then it kind of faded away because they really appear to be really difficult to understand and to capture and to study with the scientific means that we had back then. And then reading about dreams, I started reading about the writings of Robin Cara Harris, that is one of my mentors now, that showed how psychedelics could actually be a better way to access the unconscious mind compared to dreams, because they are more easy, like the states that they induce, they're easier to access rather than dreams, and they're very like evanescent, and they're really like as soon as you wake up, they're almost gone. And so I linked from dreams to psychedelics, and to psychedelics. I started to become passionate again into neuroscience, and I realized that I didn't have the tools back then to understand what was really happening in the mind. And then I decided, okay, if I'm really passionate and interested in this, I want to first put myself into neuroscience, and then having the idea of entering into psychedelics. And then of course personal life circumstances of different kinds also make I would say a point into all of this. I had my own problems and my own like fascination with like both mental health struggles and then altered states, and I would say the two of them quite intertwined and drove me to do what I'm doing now.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much. And your recent research that you're focusing on is with 5-MeO-DMT.
Yeah.
And you're doing it at the Imperial College of London, right? So would you share more on what does experience with 5-MeO-DMT actually looks like? What is the time duration, and what do you see on the brain images, right?
Yeah.
You're looking at the brain images.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a
Yeah.
neuroscientist.
Yeah.
Yes. What do we see? What's happening in the brain when a person is under effect of 5-MeO-DMT?
Yeah, 5-MeO-DMT is quite an interest psychedelics, and it's described as a sort of like Mount Everest of psychedelics because of its intensity and the profoundness that it can have. It's very short acting, lasts like 20 minutes maximum, but it induces these experiences that are so intense that are very difficult to describe and to study with like normal scientific means. it's this drug that Robin defined as a sort of ego vaporizer, that I find it very fascinating, because we talk about this idea of ego dissolution of psychedelics, that they loosen the grip of our ego and self-consciousness on our mind, so that we can perceive, I would say, what's out there through different lenses. And this normally becomes a concept when you are on mushrooms and you start to feel interconnected with everything, and you feel that your mind is in the state of expansion. But this is quite different from what 5-MeO gives you, because 5-MeO in a few seconds it just pushes you in a state in which it's everything that you normally define as normal consciousness is collapsing. There's no space, there's no time, there's no thought, there's no self, and there is this state in which you feel almost like everything and nothing at the same time. And people sometimes can describe feeling this pure white light or this total blackness. And emotions, they're like pure emotions, so it's not that they're experiencing an emotions, they can just be emotions, from joy to terror to bliss. And it's this state of complete boundlessness that lasts for maybe 10-15 minutes, and then normally people tend to come back, and they come back can be quite challenging too, because what we have seen is that when people are coming back from this very intense state, is almost like the normal grip of the self on our flood of thoughts and emotions is very loosened, and people tend to have deep emotional experiences in the second part of the 5-MeO trip, which is something that I found very fascinating, because you see people sometimes having this deep catharsis in which they cry, in which they shake, in which is almost like there's something very somatic about this drug that is not in all the other psychedelics. And it might be because when you're coming back, the higher level of the brain are almost scrambled into still messy to function properly, and there's a sort of upsurge of our limbic emotional regions, our primary consciousness, in a way in which some people call it. And it can feel very childlike, very in primal, in the way in which these experiences unfold. And then in 20 minutes people are almost fully back to normal. But the afterwards of this process, it's a lot what matters, especially therapeutically. I know you're interested in integration, and I know on 5-MeO there's more and more on the focus on the integration aspect of what's happening, because it's an experience that can unfold over time a lot after the effects are done. So it's short acting, but the readjustment and the coming back into your own sense of self after having this full dissolution can be sometimes challenging, can take time, and so the integration of this drug can be particularly important. And I actually did a very long digression before going into the brain, because I feel I just wanted to give a background on what this drug is.
Yes.
And because also we don't really know much about the brain yet. It's still a bit of a work in progress. We have some very preliminary data that were analyzed and published by one of my supervisors, Dr. Chris Timmerman, and we found from some data that we collected in retreat settings with 5-MeO that there is a drop of some brainwaves that we call alpha, and a drop of brainwaves that we call beta. That basically, the idea of these brainwaves, the alpha waves, are the one that are mostly active when we are in a state of normal relaxation, and they have quite an inhibitory function to the lower brain areas, and they might be linked to the running of our sense of self in the back. When you just close your eyes, think about yourself, and think about your past and your future, the alpha pattern is prominent, and we found a drop of that, which could be related to a drop of our normal internal voice and internal narration, and the drop of the beta wave might be related to a sense of boundlessness of your sense of having a body. So both bodily dissolution and narrative dissolution of your sense of self. And another very interesting finding that was found by some colleagues at UCL, and that they also collected data on 5-MeO, DMT in retreat settings at Tandava retreats. That is one of the most famous 5-MeO retreat centers in Mexico. They found something particularly interested in their brain waves, because they found out that 5-MeO really increased the intensity of delta waves and very slow brain waves that are normally related to sleep states. And and this is something that was also found in animals. And basically, it seems that 5-MeO almost induces a state of like paradoxical anesthesia and unconsciousness, in which like you're conscious, but it's almost like your brain looks almost as in a state of deep sleep. And what my colleagues at UCL found that was particularly interested in that normally when you're asleep or in a state of deep anesthesia, this delta brain waves are very synchronized around the brain. So it's very like spreaded across the cortex, while it seems that under 5-MeO DMT the brain activity was way less spreaded and tended to like be just related to just small parts of the brain, and maybe like less rhythmic in the way it was. And it's different than other psychedelics. It's still very preliminary, and I would say from there it's what we are trying to understand with the study that we are running, which has a high density GCAP that like has more than 200 electrodes, and at the same time we're asking live readings of ego dissolution in order to like really trying to understand what's happening to the self when we disrupt it with such a powerful compound.
Right. Wow. So fascinating. And you're right that other psychedelics, they definitely have capacity to expand our awareness, but not necessarily a complete dissolution that is happening. We can have out-of-body experiences and really expanded, altered states of consciousness, in some cases through ayahuasca, which is DMT, right? People do face the death of ego, but that's not something as common. And it sounds like in 5-MeO DMT, that's the direct experience of the ego dissolution. And I watched the webinar with Dr. Christopher Timmerman, who you're referring to, and he called it a deconstruction. It was very interesting the way he named it and the verbiage he used. He called in 5-MeO DMT experience as a deconstruction experience, deconstruction of consciousness, I'm assuming he's referring to, versus as DMT experience as more a construction experience. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think he's absolutely right. And it's very fascinating how these two molecules that are like the two most intense psychedelics that we have, one is NN-DMT, that is the one contained in ayahuasca, and the other one is 5-MeO DMT, that it's the one contained in the toad. They have almost like radical opposite effects on self-consciousness. And we have DMT that brings forth this like crazy world of experiences where like you feel almost you enter in different dimensions, you can meet entities and almost sentient beings, and it really feels you're going somewhere else. And the other one, it takes everything completely away. And the molecules are very similar, but the effects are like polar opposites, and we don't really know why it's the case yet.
Right.
And both of these experiences can have positive effects on yourself. Both can be challenging, both can like alter your metaphysical beliefs on reality. So they are both very intense experiences, but at the very polar ends of the spectrum, which I find it like very, very fascinating for also all the metaphysical implications that these experiences can also have.
Yes, and with your background in deep analysis, right, and dream analysis and psychoanalysis, how do you believe that ego dissolution and all this deconstruction of our sense of self can actually help someone who is faced with mental health challenge or depression or addiction? Like, what's the key component there of what a potential benefit?
Yeah. I mean, I think we live in a period of our history in which we probably have an overactive sense of self. We have an overactive ego. And our sense of self, that is normally what we perceive as being us, being you, is your sense of self. It's something that like gave humans a crazy evolutionary advantage over other animals, because it likely emerged at some point in human history in which, through language, through the capacity of maybe like being is slowly getting scared of predators and things around us. We were just not scared of them having them like close to us, but we slowly became capable of imagining the threat, and slowly by imagining this threat, we and being able to talk about this with other peers through initially simple gestures, and then with language that became more and more elaborate, we became able to have an internal self-narrative. But the self-narrative over time slowly developed to the point of almost becoming like a dictator inside our brain, and to a point in which it's overactive and traps us inside our minds. And it's like it could be the greatest advantage that human ever had, but it's almost also the biggest curse that human ever had, because it's related to a lot of mental health struggles, because we struggle so much to be present in the moment, and we are constantly lost in thinking about the future, or being melancholic, or being stuck in the past. And when you are in either of those, you're never here. And your thoughts can really create the reality that you experience. And I'm not really saying this in any like metaphysical or woo-woo ways, but it's just because there's like so much noise in the world that if you really believe something, it becomes the reality that you experience. And we see it in depression, because people with depression, they tend to think about the future like if something bad happens in their life, they will think that is because of them, because they are unworthy, because they are unlovable. And if something good happens in their life, they will just tend to think it's circumstantial. And this is depressive bias is a very well-known effect study in clinical psychology. And so this is such a hint that like if you are blinded by your self narrative. And psychedelics seems to be capable of disrupting, or at least relaxing, the self-narrative that, when combined with therapy, can have the potential of potentially restructure the sense of who you are in a way that is more adaptive to live a fulfilling and a healthy life.
Wow, I really appreciate the way you named it. We are blinded by that narrative, by that self-narrative that is constantly happening in our mind. It's very true. The other question I have for you is, when we talk about the dissolution, when we talk about the death of ego, do you believe that can be the real experience of death, actually, that is happening? Because based on the book of Strassman, right, the research was done back in the 90s, but it was interesting that when he explored the DMT, he said, they found the DMT released in our gland, right, when we're born and when we die. So from your research was 5-MeO-DMT, and maybe personal perspective as well, not only research. Do you believe when we take the substances, the psychedelic substances, is that an actual experience of death?
Interesting question. And so like I just start by like slightly like debunking the idea of like DMT related to like being born and dying, because it's something that I would say it's not been disproven, but it hasn't been proven either. And it's there's some research that shows some release of DMT at when rats are dying, but there's nothing that has been found in humans yet. And the idea that is linked, like we would need such a high level of DMT that is kind of like complex to understand how the brain could do that. There could be other means through this happens. ones that has been posited potentially created like states like near-death experiences is that we have serotonin 2A receptors that are the ones that are activated by psychedelics, but they can also be endogenous and like internally activated by serotonin in states of very high stress in which the affinity of serotonin for 5-HT2A receptors is increasing, and there could be the idea that like when you are experiencing a really high stress, like the one of being close to death, there's an endogenous activations of these receptors that is happening because the brain is really trying to find a way to survive in a state of pure chaos, and this could potentially explain near-death experiences, but of course they're all guesses. And on like more metaphysical perspective, like it's an interesting question, and I've been definitely thinking a lot about it, and it's fascinating to me seeing like how the psychedelic community talks about this, because there are the people that are like very in the ayahuascas and DMT circles that are like, oh, like when we die we will go back in that realms of entities, of beings, and of like almost like esoteric and colorful with all those entities. And then there are the people that are in the 5-MeO community that are like, oh no, we are just like pure consciousness, and when we die we will return in this like pure all-encompassing consciousness, and we are just drops of consciousness almost coming down from this all-encompassing thing. And it's almost, they are all different. And if you look even in the histories of religions and how people like started to develop narratives about what's in the after death, and the mystics and people that like have had experiences in which they almost touched a sense of what's in the of what's behind, they all come back with all very different interpretations. And for me this is very fascinating, because it's almost whispering to me that that's just a mystery that cannot be solved. And the more you try to explain that mystery, the more you try to go inside there and trying to understand what this all be about, the more it's just like it will just remain a mystery, and it will just stay elusive. And there's someone that called it like a magnum mysterium, that is just the maximum mystery. And so I think the best way to approach it is just keep it lightly, thinking there might be something there. I'm not like, maybe we will never be able to fully grasp it, and at the same time just appreciate that life is a funny mystery that we will navigate, but we will never have all the answers to. And I tend to take this approach in a lot of things in life, and especially when weird things happens that I struggle to explain.
Yes, and as you were reflecting, what showed up for me is perhaps death, just as life, such a super subjective experience. What you said, it's very true. Everyone who speaks about or try to speak about death experience, right? They all come back with the different, something different to say, something different experience that it was very individual to them, very subjective.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thought for me. I was like, wow, can death actually also be a subjective experience, just like life is, right?
Yeah.
And what I find most interesting is that I'm talking to neuroscientists, and yet we're talking about the same questions that the ancient traditions and spirituality always explored: the nature of reality, the nature of awareness, the nature of self, the ego dissolution, right?
Yeah.
Those questions and those topics are very familiar to me from my spiritual path and exploring all the Eastern tradition. And yet here we are in a scientific world, you doing clinical research, and we asking the same questions. So the science and the self-exploration and spirituality are really merging. How do you find that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think this speaks to me that there might just actually maybe be a lot of different ways to access and look at the same phenomenon, and that spirituality is something that is very broadly encompassing a lot of themes that it can be looked through a lot of different vantage points. Like what you said is like not fully related, but it kind of remind me of this experience that I had like maybe a couple of weeks ago that I went to a Buddhist center in London, and I was there to meditate, and I saw a Lama meditator that was meditating using this little chain with a lot of different
Smaller beats.
Yeah, and he was meditating using this chain with all this, and he was moving around it to concentrate into it. And I looked at that, and that immediately reminded me of my grandmother. She's Christian, and she prays with the same chain that has a Christ, but it looks exactly the same. And that I would just had this moment where I was like, wow, like they're doing the same thing. They are trying to access the same state. It is a state of deep focus in which you're there and you're like trying to transcend your normal self narrative in order to try to get a glimpse of something spiritual. And the two of them might not agree on a million of different things, but at the same time, like when I was looking at it, I'm like, you're trying to do the same thing. It's just that it's been taught to you by different teachers in a different tradition. And I think this applies to a lot of different of different things that are characterizing religion and the approach to God. And that there are like kind of like a sense of shared community, a sense of like repeating similar patterns, prayers and mantras, and helping each others. And it's kind of like you see that across cultures, and you see these practices that are evolved with the history of humanity in trying to connect with something bigger than ourselves. And like, is it God? What is God? I think people came to a lot of different conclusions, but I don't think that's really important at the end. And there is research. There is a lot of research showing that like believing in something bigger than yourself, it's pretty good for your mental health. And people that are believing in God, they have like reduced all-cause mortalities. They suffer less health issues, and this, yes, could be linked to the fact that like they have stronger communities, and they're less alone. I think that's a part of it. But at the same time, there is also some research that shows that this is more intense with people that are in religious communities rather than people that they are just in normal communities, maybe playing soccer and so forth. And this still doesn't speak to the fact that believing in something transcendent will make you better. But it's just that like there might be practices that are built around spirituality that might just be beneficial for the human nature in a lot of different means, and maybe different cultures came to them through very different means. But I would say, and still all of this doesn't say anything about the nature of whatever there might be there. But it's just kind of like hinting to me that like humans, found ways to connect with something that gives them something beautiful in a way, and gives meanings, gives positivity in life in the face of struggles. And I find that meaningful and worth looking at through whatever means you want to.
Right. So there are different paths, right? But the question remains, like, where do we belong? Where my sense of self belong, right?
Yeah.
Yes, very beautiful. Integration. So you mentioned that you do believe that integration can be quite an essential mechanism for psychedelic research. And how do you incorporate integration protocols into your clinical research?
So I'm not an expert on the topic, because we in our study specifically we ran it on psychedelic experienced people, and it was very brain imaging focused. And so we didn't have much emphasis on the integration of that particular population. But I know from colleagues that especially are doing this work in retreat settings, at Tandava retreats, like Victoria, Joel, and Otto, that are like three close friends that are running like the 5MEO education platforms, and the biggest 5MEO retreat center in Mexico, that they have such an emphasis on integration to the point that they're saying experience will be just what it is, and then later on we will put a lot of emphasis in trying to integrate something that is ineffable by nature, which can be very different from all other psychedelics, because 5-MeO a lot of the times doesn't really have a narrative, doesn't really have like a line of source to experience and revisit, but it might be somatic, it might be very embodied, it might just be about like the nature of reality, and like how they are integrating this. It's by like using a mix of psychoanalysis, spirituality, and somatic psychotherapy, and trying to like put all these things together in order to like create an approach that is just not about your narrative self, but is also about all the connection with mind and body that, especially with this drug, can be particularly important.
This is very interesting because you're right. Usually it is about the narrative and